Hello, people. I finally updated my webcam, so now it doesn't look like I'm like looking through a foggy shower lens when I go live. So that's pretty neat. Um, I'm trying to do lives more often now, just so that I have some more time to talk and I can kind of like change up the type of content I offer to appeal to all sorts of different people. Because I have like the podcast for people who prefer just listening to like audio stuff, and then I just do these occasional lives to give people the chance to like answer questions or ask questions, I should say. And it's better with like a live video versus like pre-record stuff, great. But I just like talking about these types of things, and there's been so many big changes that I've had going on in my life over the last little while that like it's always nice to share if people are willing to listen. And then I also always leave these live so that people, I mean, I always leave the recordings live so that people can listen to the recordings after. But I wanted to talk about like horses and mental health because I think that that's a really important thing. And there's a theory that I have that I can't like necessarily prove other than talking about my own experience with it. But I think that there's like a massive connection between human mental health and how we go about training our horses and how we approach working with horses in general. I think that the way in which we train our horses impacts us mentally and physically more than what we're aware of, and that it can be a massive source of anxiety and depression and whatnot if it's not aligning with your internal values. Because this is something that I definitely found with myself that was pretty pervasive and has been for years throughout my riding career. And the reason being is that I had a lot of perspectives on like how I felt about the world that weren't actually in alignment with how I was approaching horse training. And the more I've kind of just like explored and unpacked that, the more I've realized how I need to change how I show up for horses and also for myself. But in learning about the horses and showing up for them differently, it kind of gave me permission and license to show up for myself differently as well. So it was kind of a more friendly, less personal way to start making changes to my own life and like for my own mental health that I probably would not have otherwise made, because it's a lot more intimidating to do things that are specifically just for yourself. Whereas if you're looking at it through the lens of making changes for your horses and then they happen to benefit you, it's less intimidating to kind of step into that. So what I've noticed for myself is the more I've altered the way that I train horses and approach horse training, the happier I have become as a person and the more I've been able to work on my anxiety, because I've always struggled with anxiety. I have pretty substantial social anxiety. Um, and I would never have really felt at home within myself until fairly recently. And I think a large portion of this was because I was actually suppressing how I was really feeling in certain moments. And I wasn't being authentic to myself and doing what I wanted. And I was also ignoring how certain situations brought out a flight or fight response in me, and how I was actually viscerally uncomfortable with the way that I was going about a lot of different aspects of my life. And horses have been one of the constants in my life forever now. I started riding when I was 4 years old, so they've always been part of my life and they've played a huge role in my growth as a person, which is why I wanted to talk about this in specific, because there's just such a huge connection to the changes that I've started to make in my life that I have been making over the course of years, and how big of a role horses have played in allowing for that change to occur. And it really did, a lot of it did start from when I started to kind of explore equine behavioral science more and get more involved in that and start being more intentional in the way that I went about training my horses. And also just kind of dove into the curiosity that I had about horse behavior, because I've always been curious about psychology and just the way that things work. And that's something that's been very important to me growing up, because it just helps me understand things better. It helps me understand why I do things the way that I do if I understand like how they actually work. And that's been important to me in a number of different ways. So when I started studying horse behavior, it became really, really hard to ignore how much crossover there was between human psychology and animal psychology, and how animals learn and also how people learn and how we all respond to stress and anxiety. It was a connection that like I couldn't really look away from. And it kind of led me to studying human psychology more too and just learning more about that aspect of it. But it also provided me a far greater understanding of horse behavior, and then also led to me kind of almost combining the two, where I would learn things that totally tracked and made sense from a human psychological standpoint, and then I'd start to get curious and wonder, like, what are the odds that this also applies to horses? And it's led to me having like a more multifaceted view of the way that we go about horse training. Like, an example of this is that I'm a neurodivergent person, so I started to wonder, what are the odds that animals experience neurodivergency? And then the more that I thought about it, I was like, it's very unlikely that we don't see divergencies in the physical body and mental body in other animals. It's just harder to diagnose. Because even with people, we struggle to actually diagnose neurodivergency and to explore certain mental health problems and just differences in the way that people think. So it'd be even harder to do it with animals that don't speak the same language as us. But as I started thinking about that, it really started to change the way that I approach horse training in general, because it does explain why so many horses will respond differently to the same types of training methods. And like, particularly if there is neurodivergency in horses, I do think that there would be a lot that's influenced by trauma. And I would say the same applies to me with the way that I think and how I perceive the world. Is there is it definitively an influence of trauma for that. And trauma, obviously, like, it inevitably influences the way you think about things, and same with horses, because if you've had bad experiences, your brain is going to try to keep you safe by holding on to those bad experiences and using them to give you information about new environments and help you to be more careful. And that's something that I don't think we afford most animals the level of understanding that they deserve, because we kind of go about things from a very human centric standpoint, where we're so immersed in the way that we perceive the world and how we think and feel about things, that we aren't necessarily considering about the perspectives of animals specifically, but also other people. But animals more so from the standpoint of they can't actually physically like voice how they're feeling in a very clear way in the same way that people can. So it's kind of put me in a situation where I've had to really pause and seriously reconsider the approach that I have towards horse training, because I've kind of leveled with the fact that now that I have my diagnosis for ADHD and that I know why I perceive the world so differently from certain people, I've been able to look back on so many situations throughout my growing up where I struggled with things when I was learning, and where teachers were not fair to me, and where they lacked patience, and where they took things highly personally and punished me for their lack of ability to understand me, and were just taking out their lack of understanding or lack of ability to really see where I was coming from on me. And as a result, it really impacted my learning. So when I started to look at that and draw that parallel, it became next to impossible to not look at how I have actually done that to horses, and how I elected to see the horse for who they are and what their individual struggles have been, because I've become frustrated by why they're behaving the way that they are due to my own lack of understanding. And when I started to really unpack that, I started to recognize how crappy I felt those moments when teachers and other people were doing that to me, and how I felt forced to abandon myself in order to be heard and seen by people who otherwise refused to see me unless I like put a mask on and changed the way that I expressed myself, or kind of like shoved how I was actually feeling under the rug and then responded to them. And as I started to look at horses through this more compassionate lens and alter the way that I went about training them and approaching my work with them, I kind of was forced to do that for myself. And it welcomed it in a way that was a lot easier to grasp than what it would have been without kind of viewing it through the lens of the horse first and then throwing it back onto myself as a result, out of necessity, because then it started to be where a lot of the views that I was developing about horses weren't consistent with how I felt about myself and people in general. So then it naturally started to change those, because they were out of alignment. And by being able to use horses for like a vessel for empathy and compassion, it has allowed me to afford that level of empathy and compassion for myself in a way that I hadn't before. So working with horses has changed my life exponentially because they're ultimately what have led me to discovering parts of myself that I had long since abandoned, and also just to really look at the ways that there's so many parallels between our expectations for how horses should learn and how we should carry out training with this kind of one size fits all approach, and how we have these set timelines in mind for horses, and also how we do the same to people, and how much of the school systems that a lot of us grew up in are focused on basically making you assimilate to the expectations at any cost, even the cost of your own mental and physical wellness. And it also made me think of like how many years I've lost that would have been really good learning years because I've been so stressed that I haven't really been able to fully take in the information that was being offered to me. And then I kind of thought about how I've done that to horses as well, because I've trained horses in degrees of stress where they're not actually taking in what I'm teaching to them. They're not fully responding to their environment in the way that they should, because I wasn't allowing for it. I was punishing them for showing how they were authentically feeling in the moment, and I was effectively suppressing their communication as a result. And as someone who's had that done to me for years by all types of different people in my life, it really spoke to me to kind of look at like what I was doing and how I was essentially fulfilling a role that I had to fulfill. So then the more I started to dive into positive reinforcing autonomy is, I started to recognize how for myself, practicing more autonomous choice and being less pressured to be influenced by what I thought other people would want me to do and say, and what I thought would be the more popular things to do and say, it opened the doors for me to feel so much more free. And then the more I started to do that, because it was really uncomfortable in the beginning, so it took practice, but the more I started to do that, the more I realized how reinforcing it was, and how rewarding it was, and how much happier it was making me. And then this made it easier to afford my horses the same types of freedoms, because initially starting out, I think one of the huge barriers that a lot of people experience when we're looking at more holistic training styles, such as like clicker training and positive reinforcement, is that the idea of offering horses autonomous choice is something that's off-putting to a lot of people. Like the idea of allowing your horse to exit and leave a training session when they want to is something that a lot of people don't want to do, because they look at it through the lens of, oh, if I do that, then they're going to do it all the time, which can be true in some regards. But something that I think is lost on people that we really need to look at when we're talking about training horses and changing the way that we look at things is that when you start offering autonomy after previously not having offered it at all, naturally the choice to say no is going to occur more frequently because they haven't had the choice to say no. And because of the work itself has become a lot more like aversive to them and a lot less pleasant. So, um, so what that means is that like when you start giving them the choice, naturally they're going to be like, I would rather not do that, because they haven't had the choice before. And now suddenly they can opt out and it's a viable option. And a lot of people, when they start doing this, fall into the temptation of getting frustrated by the fact that their animal is not wanting to participate, and then forcing them to, which then effectively undoes the progress that you can make by allowing them the choice to opt out of work. And then it kind of causes you to revert back to old ways, which is really easy to do, because it is really heartbreaking and sad when you start to give your horse the choice to leave and then they leave, because it hurt. Like my feelings were very hurt a lot of the time, because I had created this narrative that my horses loved their jobs and that we were partners and stuff. But then when I actually started to give them the choice to participate or to opt out, it became very, very clear that that wasn't actually the case, and that if they got the choice to opt out, that they would quite regularly. So in the beginning stages of doing that, horses said no all the time, and it was really hard to cope with, and it made me want to revert back to old methods. And honestly, for a time I did, because it was really punishing to have my horses perpetually saying no. But I think something that's lost on people in starting this process, that you kind of need to do it to really realize the benefit of it, is that once you start allowing them the choice to say no and then really heavily reinforcing when they do say yes, you start to get yeses more frequently by default of saying no. And I know that that sounds really counterproductive, but it's because autonomy is reinforcing. Giving autonomous choice and allowing animals or people the ability to seek out interaction with you and also choose to opt out of it without any penalty, it's really reinforcing and it makes them want to interact with you more as a result because if they learn that interaction itself is pleasant and that they get reinforced for it, but if they at any point decide they've had enough that they can leave without penalty and without being forced to, they are given a level of freedom that makes it a lot more pleasant and reinforcing to engage in the first place. And then you start to get way more willing yeses just by allowing that initial no. And we kind of have that's one of the hardest things in starting to do more rewards based training and where you value the autonomy of your horse more is that having to see how often they say no initially when you let them have the choice to is really hurtful and it's really hard. But I also looked at it through my own lens and thought about all of the times where I felt pressured and obligated to do things for other people. And as someone who has been a chronic people pleaser, this has happened a lot. And I thought about how I felt in all of those moments, and I did not feel good about it. I didn't actually want to do things a lot of the times that I said yes, but I felt coerced and obligated to, whether or not the people actually directly coerced me or not. What was the coercion was that I felt that if I said no, that I would lose out on that connection and I would be abandoned in that moment. And sometimes people created that environment for me by actually abandoning me when I turned them down or said no. But other times it was like a self-created situation where because of prior experience, I was worried about that happening if I did say no. And then it resulted in me being resentful when I said yes to situations that I didn't actually want to engage in. And it wasn't very fair to the, they weren't forcing me to technically. In some cases there definitely was coercive force, but basically the gist of what I'm trying to say is that I felt really bad and unhappy about doing things where I felt coerced to. Whereas when I was actually given free choice to opt out without penalty and like not no passive aggression, no direct aggression, no anger or anything, where I could actually say no to people and they would just be like, okay, and move on with their lives. It made it so that I was way more likely to say yes to them in the future. And the same applies to our horses. When you don't make them feel like saying no is not an option, they're more likely to say yes because they're not being forced to do something against their will every single time. And the other thing to consider is that by allowing them to say no, it doesn't mean that in like in an emergency situation that you're just going to do that. Like if you need to evacuate a horse for an emergency and they're not opting in, obviously in those circumstances you would do what you have to do to keep them safe and to get them to where they need to go for help. But the fact of the matter is the more you offer choice, the less situations you're going to have where you get a direct no where they actually heavily opt out. And you also don't meet as heavy opposition. Whereas the horses who are forced to do things against their will all the time and have grown used to that, oftentimes when they finally have enough, you get heavy opposition that can be very, very dangerous. And the same applies to people as well. So I've learned that like in doing that where I offer my horses more choice, like I have quieter training sessions. It's less stressful to me. It's more reinforcing to me and it's actually helped me manage my own anxiety and frustration as a result. I used to get way more frustrated when I felt the need to fill a quota and where I was making my horses do things because I felt like I had to, and because I felt pressured by the way that the horse industry functioned, and that if they said no to me and I couldn't make them do the thing, that it made me less of a horse person. So I would end up just getting into these all out wars with horses where they'd be saying hard no's and I'd just be fighting with them. And then by the end of it, it was like reinforcing to me to finally force them to do what I wanted them to do because it made me feel powerful and in control. And that was the primary reinforcer to me, is that alleviation of frustration after what was like an all out war with a horse who was trying to say no a bunch of times, first quieter, but then when I kept ignoring it, they said it louder and louder and louder and louder. And it wasn't fun. Like during all the times where we were like having these fights, like I was really frustrated and I wasn't having fun. And then the only thing that really brought me relief and enjoyment is having the fight stop and ending up and getting victory. But there were times where I wouldn't get victory, where it would end on a bad note, and then I just had a horse who's really stressed and now is lathered in sweat, and who learns that the cessation of our sessions is like the most rewarding thing that can happen to them because they hate the work so much. And this is a really common theme in the horse world where people will give their horse the end of the session as a means of reinforcing what they want to. And by default, if you look at that at face value for what it is, if it is really reinforcing and feels good to your horse to stop doing the sessions that they're doing with you, then there's no way around the fact that the training itself is aversive and not fun to the horse. And the more I started to think about this and go, like, what incentive do my horses have to like what I'm doing if stopping the training is reinforcing and enjoyable to them? I couldn't answer that question, because if I want them to enjoy the training, it shouldn't. That would mean that they're not enjoying the training. If me a break from training is reinforcing to them, it means that they're not having a good time. And this isn't to say that you shouldn't offer breaks, but if it's within the context of when does what you want, that you're stopping training them to essentially reinforce what you're getting, it means that they found the training itself so difficult and unpleasant that when you stop it, it is reinforcing to them. And I wasn't really comfortable with that anymore, because I wanted my horses to enjoy what we were doing. And then it resulted in me having to completely reevaluate my priorities with how I trained horses. And honestly, it was like a bit of an ego death, because so much of my identity as a horse person had been built through what I could make horses do and how fast I could make them do it and how much I could make them do. And when you suddenly take all of that away, then your value system for yourself has become so disrupted that you don't really know who you are anymore as that's taken away. And you essentially have to reinvent who you are as a person and find a new identity. And that's what I've had to do, and that's also why, like, my channels and stuff have changed so much over the years, because I was spending so many years that I've shared online in the public eye where I really didn't know who I was, and I was scrambling to figure out who I was. And my lack of identity was making me really frustrated and angry and defensive, because I had no sense of self or value system for myself of how I felt about myself as a person that wasn't completely reliant on how other people perceived me and the approval of other people, which means that you're never really going to be fully happy, because you're never going to get approved by everybody. And if you value the approval of anyone and everyone and not just the people close to you, you're always going to be the target of criticism in a way that's going to unseat you and unsettle you. And that is where I was coming from. And in offering my horses more freedom, I started to afford myself more freedom, and allowing my horses to be their authentic selves, I started to allow myself to be my more authentic self. And then I started to do more stuff for myself for self-care, and started to train horses in a way where the priority is me feeling good about things. I didn't want to continue to sell out and do things just to fill a quota or to meet specific timelines when it ended up making me feel bad. And I started to be more conscious of how I was actually feeling when I was training horses. Whereas in the past, this is something that I suppressed and didn't really acknowledge. So I wasn't really fully aware of how bad the way that I was doing things was actually making me feel, and how much I actually didn't like it, until I started to explore more of that. And it's been a long journey, because honestly, it started off way slower because there was a lot more resistance on my end to kind of walk down that path. And then also, the process of allowing my horses more choice in the beginning and to like opt out of work was also a lot slower, because as soon as I started to offer them that, especially the horses who had the most aversive association with work, the more they said no. So it really slowed things down, because they would say no all the time, and then I couldn't do things with them, so I had to be way more patient. But then having to be more patient also taught me a lot about slowing down and just enjoying the small things, and starting to enjoy groundwork more, and starting to enjoy doing less with my horses, instead of having so much of my value as my for myself as a person and a trainer come from like doing lots and lots of stuff with them. And it's taken a long time to get there, but it's honestly been so rewarding for my own mental health, and like has been so freeing. And it's taught me a lot about trauma for myself, and also trauma about animals, because like so many horses have so much trauma, and I think this is something that we really downplay. Horses experience so much trauma. The average horse has gone through so much trauma, no matter how well they wear it, because some cope with it better than others, but the average horse has gone through a lot of trauma, a lot. And we aren't really understanding enough about it. Like, one of the biggest traumas that every single horse pretty much goes through is the trauma of being weaned, because we still have yet to really normalize kind and healthy ways of weaning horses. A lot of horses are weaned cold turkey and they're weaned quite young, and a lot of horses are then kept alone and away from other horses, and they're not really taught how to socialize, and that's one of the first big disruptions in their healthy living circumstances is weaning. And then you have all of the smaller traumas, like how they're started under saddle. If they're really scared, work through that fear and be terrified and just like forced to work through that stress and have it ignored and suppressed, then that's another trauma that's adding on to it. So a lot of the issues that we deal with horses are coming from a place of trauma, and we don't really take enough time to really sit with that and understand that, like, while it doesn't feel real to us, it doesn't change the fact that it's real to them. And similarly with people, there's a lot of people who go through really traumatic events that they then downplay and they suppress how bad it made them feel and how much it's altered their perspective of the world. And then they never get to feel fully heard, seen, and understood because they're taught that a lot of their value as a person comes from suppressing trauma and suppressing how they actually feel, because we've kind of created this society where we want to ignore and move away from difficult things and pretend they're not there because dealing with those problems is emotionally laborious. But then by suppressing them, we perpetually just have to deal with them again and again and again. And it doesn't really help the situation long term. So, learning more about horse trauma has taught me more about my own trauma and honoring that, and also honoring my own feelings about myself and honoring who I am as a person, and just honoring how I want to show up in life and how I want to show up with horses and being comfortable with that. And I think what people will notice is that um the more you start to honor yourself and the less reliant you become on basically getting approval of other people, especially when it comes to like working with your horse, the more doing so becomes, especially when you notice that your relationship with them improves. So sorry, I have one question from Teresa. Um, I have a young, about 3-year-old mare, the rescue horse that came from a bad place and obviously had trauma. We have been unable to get her to load in a trailer. At first, we also tried the force method, but she stood through the wood pen. That showed us that she definitely has major trauma. We have been trying the opt-in method. It's been about 2 months and we're not getting any closer. We don't know what else to do. Any suggestions? So trailering in specific, especially with horses with trauma, is hard because they have to like agree to being trapped and essentially in an area that they can't easily exit. So it's like a natural thing for horses to be afraid of in the first place. Um, that's why I use like a lot of food with trailer loading. So essentially, like with horses who are that afraid, what I start out with doing is that you're gonna like basically just reward them for approaching the trailer at all, rather than making your goal to get into the trailer. Um, because walking towards the trailer and the approach of the trailer is like the first step towards getting them in the trailer. So if you start to work on getting them to um load in the trailer, or like walk towards the trailer, look at the trailer and do all of the precursor steps before they're actually getting in, um then you're going to help them get comfortable approaching the trailer. And the more readily they'll approach the trailer, the better they're going to be at getting into the trailer eventually. So you just gradually get them used to approaching the trailer, walking towards the trailer, getting comfortable with looking at the trailer and watching it from further away, and then gradually get them more comfortable with walking up to it comfortably and confidently. And then the next step would be like they put a foot on the trailer, and then making it really rewarding. Like I use a lot of food for that to help them out. um and you like parking the trailer kind of close to where they live, but not so close that like if they're so out of it that they won't go get their food and stuff, so that they can get food like away from where the trailer is in their sight lines, so they get accustomed to just looking at it, and then gradually going from there and just starting out really slow and scaffolding it with really small things. Because like again, it's something that we're not taught to really value, because when we're training horses, oftentimes the priority is to go really fast. But like a horse who's terrified of trailer loading, even making the choice to look at the trailer or even lean towards it or step towards it at all, that's a step in the direction of the behavior that you're wanting to teach, and it's one that you should reinforce and reward. um And the more you do that, the more regularly you're going to have horses that will offer those behaviors willingly, because it's done in such a low stress manner that they like going towards the trailer or looking at it as the precursor to getting forced into it. So it can take a lot of time, and the more trauma a horse has had with that specific behavior, the longer it'll take. But those are the types of things that I start with. I have a trailer loading series on my website with like 6 hours of video footage of like how I go about doing that. And like honestly, it can be you kind of have to be in it for the long haul, because even as they start to load regularly and get in easily, stuff like starting the engine of the truck and closing them in and then actually going for a drive, all of those things can scare them again. So it can be a long process to slowly build up to that. And it can be undone by situations where you might need to move them or do something fast before they're completely ready. But the slower you practice and the more you kind of build that foundation of trust, the better it gets. And like food is just such a powerful motivator for helping break a negative association towards something they're afraid of, because you're giving something that they like. And that's also why I'm so encouraging of people to try using rewards based training, because when a horse is really scared, they're not going to find physical touch as reinforcing, even if they usually really like being scratched. But food is something that they always need and that they crave. And while you can still end up using food coercively, there's ways to use it in a really productive way that can effectively counter condition them away from being afraid of something that they typically would be. Like another example would be feeding them their meal near-ish to the trailer, like as close as they're comfortable, and just having that be a repeated association where it's like, oh, I always get a great meal when I'm by this thing. And then over time, they start to lose that negative association. So it's just like really systematic desensitization where you're essentially creating a positive association with something that's previously negative, using counter conditioning tactics to help them become more comfortable. But honoring the fear and just noticing how afraid they actually are rather than viewing it as an inconvenience, I think is a really important start, because a lot of people who have those difficult horses that really panic to the point where they'll like break things or bust through doorways or run people over or get like really dangerous. A lot of people get really frustrated and upset by that because it is scary. And then that frustration ends up coming out in how they train and handle that horse. And it ends up being a problem that becomes lasting, because they treat that behavior like it's the horse intentionally trying to give them a hard time and trying to be intentionally bad, when that's never the case. It's the horse reacting to how they feel in the moment and being afraid, and it just happens to be inconvenient for us as humans. So I think that's the most important thing in any training. Like if I could give one piece of advice, it'd be to like separate your ego from training and understand that like your perception of what's going on isn't necessarily going to be the accurate one, especially if that perception is colored by like it's me versus the horse. Um, and this is something that a lot of us are taught to do. We're taught to view it as us versus the horse. We're taught to view it as the horse is out to get us. And when they behave badly, that it's intentional and that we need to be the boss, that we need to put them in their place. And it creates a really unhealthy dynamic where it's like it should be you and the horse versus the problem rather than you versus the horse, because anytime a horse is giving us a hard time, they're struggling with something. And at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if we understand their fear and where it's coming from, because you don't really need to understand it to honor it. And we shouldn't need to know the entire background story of a horse or a human for that matter to be conscious of when they're having a trauma response, and how it's never going to be beneficial for trauma to punish the trauma response and to get mad at them and to essentially try to bully your way into a different reaction. And that's also what a lot of us have been taught to do with people as well, because it can be really hard and really uncomfortable to deal with really big major emotions that aren't fun and aren't always safe to deal with and aren't always like comfortable. So the more I've kind of learned about horses, the more it's taught me about humans and myself. And I've kind of really started to show up for life differently and change how I see the world and move away from having such a hierarchical viewpoint of anything, like where it's like, oh, this person's trying to like one up me, or this horse is trying to be the alpha. And it's like, no, like we've been trained that a lot of our value as people comes from how much better we can be than other people and like comparing ourselves to others. So then naturally we project that onto horses and onto other situations, when really like the horse is just doing their best job of being a horse. And even amongst people, it's like we're all just trying to exist as human beings. And we don't have to be in constant competition with each other. Like collaboration and like teamwork is like the direction that I think everyone really needs to head. And honestly, like horses, when we allow them to, are really good at that. They're really good at being community minded animals who are really conscious of like the emotional health of those around them, especially other horses, and just really conscious of their environment and really intentional about how they interact with the environment. They're very good at that. So I think there's lots to be learned from horses in specific because they're one of the most emotional and like observant and quiet beings that we might have the pleasure of interacting with ever. And I think that's also why they're so healing as creatures to be with. And the more we start learning not to fight with them and the more we start to work with them rather than against them, I think one, the safer people are going to be in handling them. Because I do think that a lot of the dangers that we experience with horses are completely man-made problems that are coming out of us being really stubborn in the way that we interact with horses and refusing to alter the way that we go about things. And two, the healthier we will become as people because it opens the door for us to be kinder and more empathetic towards ourselves and to just slow down and enjoy the moment a little bit more. And it's forever a learning process because like for me this has been a long-term process, and it's not like it's always perfect. Like I do still have days where I get frustrated, but what I've learned is that like when I do start getting frustrated, I often catch it sooner and then I just take a break and change what I'm doing for the day because I'm not in a healthy emotional state to continue going on. And it has really helped with my ability to regulate my own emotions. So there's just so much to gain in terms of like helping repair our own feelings about ourselves and also repair our relationships with our horses and also just make horse training safer the more that we learn how to understand ourselves and the animals that we work with. And I think that there's a lot to be gained from learning more about human behavior and also like how we function and how emotions change our outlook on the environment and how we oftentimes don't even know when we're emotionally triggered and how it's coloring our perspective of what's going on around us. And if we start to do that more often, we're going to be able to protect ourselves more and regulate more effectively. And the more effectively we can regulate when working with horses, the easier it is for our horses to emotionally regulate because they absolutely 100% do feed off of us and what we're doing. Uh, so yeah, that's like something that I think is super important to do, and I've learned a lot from horses and from studying horses and from opening the door to understand them better and just being more compassionate towards them. And it's really allowed me to be more compassionate towards myself and kind of change how I go about my day-to-day life. And it's something that I'm really grateful for because I'm not sure if it's something I would have actually been able to do without working with horses and having the way that I go about things change. Because also like working with a horse like Milo, um, initially I started out fighting with Milo all the time and being really punishing and overbearing and just like expecting him to work through his trauma and being really unfair to him. And I wasn't really honoring his stress and how difficult his life has been and how he views and perceives the entire environment has changed as a result of his history of trauma, especially when it's going through such a highly developmental stage of life because he was starved from the time he was born to 2 years old. So those are some really key developmental years for developing social skills and just learning how to be a horse that he was robbed of and put in a situation where he was desperate for the bare minimum. And it has led him to being different socially than what he would have been if he hadn't been starved, because I'm sure his parents and like the other horses interacted with would have been a lot harsher on him. They wouldn't have enjoyed mutual grooming and they wouldn't have been as likely to engage in these normal bonding behaviors for horses because they were just focused on survival. And then he doesn't learn how to interact and do normal horsey things in the same way, such as mutual grooming and hanging out with horses and actually getting to enjoy life. He was robbed of a lot of those social things because of how he was handled. And he was also taught that the world is a constant threat. And this also speaks for a lot of people who've gone through early childhood trauma. When trauma occurs at a really developmental stage in life, it tends to follow you more and it tends to alter your behaviors even into adulthood as you become more self-aware and aware of how the environment interacts with you and how you respond to the environment. Um, the more stuff you have happen at early ages, the more it'll change your perception as an adult. And we oftentimes aren't really taught that enough, and we're not really encouraged to unpack that enough. And then it leads us to being like completely out of sync with ourselves and to not be as understanding and kind to ourselves. So I think it's really important to learn more about how trauma impacts the nervous system and how it'll impact behavior for long term, because it's not even just about like, oh, this trauma is happening right now. It's about how it colors everything about their experience and how it can put them into a chronic state of stress where everything feels threatening, even if it's not directly related to the trauma itself. And the same applies to people. It alters your behavior growing up. It can make everything feel threatening, and it can change how you respond to the environment, and you can even tend to push people away even when what you're desperately looking for is connection. And that's something that I did for a while too, because nothing felt safe, and pushing people away was a lot safer feeling to me than getting close to them and potentially having them let me down. And since I had early childhood trauma too, I didn't have the same amount of stability and safety that people with really stable homes will grow up in when they don't have uncertainty constantly being thrown at them, and it altered the way that I view things too. For years, and honestly even still now to today, I was way more likely to view what would otherwise be viewed as like general or neutral statements as being critical and aggressive and unkind. And I was also way more likely to view behavior as being critical or unkind or aggressive, and I was constantly on the lookout for threats, and that was something that I'd learned to do from a very young age. And I'd also learned how to be hyper aware of the emotions of people around me and their body language, to the point where I was probably reading too far into things because it was adopted as a safety mechanism to try to avoid people getting mad at me or doing the wrong thing and potentially getting punished for it. And it's something that I learned because of how teachers taught me and how I was treated by peers growing up and whatnot. And it has altered how I perceive the world and made it so that it's really difficult to come home to myself. And so, because of that, I think I really resonate with horses who are in that type of mental state, because it it makes sense to me. And like with a horse like Milo, I've had to come to terms with the fact that like no amount of training, no matter how much work I put into this horse, is going to undo his early childhood experience. It's not going to put him back to being a blank slate. And I think that this is also something that people need to accept, not in the sense that you accept that your horse is perpetually going to be chronically stressed forever, but you start to realize that there's parts of them that no matter how hard you try to alter, that are always going to be there because they've had to learn them as a protective mechanism in order to survive. So for a horse like Milo, he's probably always going to have resource guarding issues to a certain extent. It's gotten way better, and I've learned ways to manage it better so that it's not as severe and prevalent. But he has been so chronically deprived of certain resources at such a crucial state of his life that it has permanently altered his behavior. Another example that I'll provide for this is that since he was starved from the ages of 0 to 2 years old, like, remember how long a year felt when you were really, really young? Or even like a month or a week? Like, time felt like it was way, way longer. Whereas the more years of life that you have under your belt, the quicker a year goes by because it's less time relative to your entire life. So, from birth to 2 years old, if your entire life is colored by hardship and mistreatment, that is like the entirety of your being, and it encompasses such a long portion of your life where you've been unable to escape these horrors. And even though, like, for Milo, that's now 10 years ago, just imagine how potent that experience was for the first 2 years of your life, where you're born into hardship and you know nothing else. You know no kindness, no idea what it's like to actually have free access to food, no idea what it's like to be in a healthy herd, and then that's just your life. So then, if that's your first experience with life for the first 2 years of your life, it's something that you take all of those experiences that you've learned and you carry them with you as you age, because that is what you have learned that you needed to do for survival for the first very influential portions of your life. Because for birth to 2 years old for a horse is like essentially going from being like a baby to like an adolescent type age, because like a 2 year old is like probably the equivalent to like an 11-year old or something, right? So it's like it colors their experience. Like, if they've had that growing up, it's not something that they're gonna ever be able to completely let go of, even as years pass. Whereas, like, if a horse grew up and had a really stable life from like 0 to 5 years old, and then they end up in a situation where they end up being starved, they have those 5 years to look back on where they have had stability and kindness and safety. And they will recover better from that than what a horse would if that was like all they knew, or if it happened to them at a very crucial developmental stage in life. And the same applies to humans. So I think it's important to kind of look at things like that, and also consider the fact that a lot of the weird quirks that we see horses develop and like stress behaviors are rooted in trauma. And it's not really up to us to say when they're healed from trauma or how potent the trauma they experienced is. And it's up to us to kind of help them manage their environment and learn how to cope with it and learn how to let go of it the best that they can. And also to not just like accept chronic stress to the point where they're not getting better, because it's not really about like being like, oh, this is just the way they are. I'm careful how I word this, because a lot of people will have a horse that's chronically stressed and explosive, and they'll just go, oh, that's the way that they are, and then they don't try to fix it, and they don't try to look into pain and underlying circumstances. But there are aspects of trauma that will follow them, and it's not reasonable to expect them to go completely away forever. Like there's going to be parts of them that have been shaped by the trauma that they experience, and it's parts of them that we have to accept and also be understanding of. So for like horses who have had a major trauma that's associated with a specific thing, like if a horse got in a trailering accident, for example, and they were really severely injured, and maybe they saw other horses die, you can probably get them to the point where they'll willingly load in a trailer. But I think that's where you'd go, is it reasonably fair to have this horse be traveling regularly for shows all the time if it's that traumatic for them? And if it's that potent of a stressor and that difficult, is it reasonable to be doing this when it's that hard for them to manage, or should it only be something that's really done out of necessity? And just things like that. And like with Milo, it's like, yeah, for some horses, going without food or going without having numerous hay stations open at all times, that might not be that stressful if they're only going without it for like half an hour, or if they only have like a few hay stations. But for him, it makes him a lot less stressed. And also it's nicer for all the horses who have to deal with his resource guarding if there's a bunch of different hay stations and they have constant access to hay, and that we're constantly replenishing the hay before it's even close to being run out, because then he never has to feel like he's in a position where food might be limited. And similarly, like, so a lot of my horses can share feed troughs, and I can tie them up side by side and have them share hay. For Milo, a lot of the time with most horses, this doesn't work. There's some horses he's willing to share with, others he's not. I'm not going to punish him for that, because he's had to fight for his food, and he learned doing that growing up, that was the only way he's going to get food. So I work within his level of like understanding and like what the trauma that he's experienced, because there's enough things that are easy enough for me to cater to that it's like, why wouldn't I? And similarly with a lot of my race horses that I've gotten off the track, I've gotten several now that have had such extreme stress responses to being stalled that I look at it and I go, why would I ever stall this horse if I don't have to? Because it makes them so freaking stressed. Like, I would always move them somewhere where they have access to like an in and out paddock or somewhere where they can escape, because the idea of being trapped and feeling claustrophobic is so all consuming to them that they panic, and you can see them go into a panic response. Like, I had one mare named Betty that literally, even in a paddock, anywhere where it was like small-ish and there was like a clear exit, she would literally stand there and weave trenches into the ground. That horse should never be stalled unless it's in an absolute emergency, and it's at the point where her level of stress is so high that, in my opinion, it's not even really worth trying to work through, outside of the sense that you could put her in an in and out paddock where she could easily walk into and leave, and that she could naturally desensitize herself to the stall by realizing that she's not going to get trapped into it. And the home that she's at now, thank goodness, is just having her out full time with other horses, and went as far as taking down all of the barriers between the stalls and making them really open concept, because it was stressful for her. And that is a level of stress that it was so extreme. Like, what she had to go through at the racetrack honestly was horrible, because she'd weave all day and all night at the racetrack. And their solution to dealing with it was either tying her up to a wall, or apparently at one point they put a 2x4 across her stall to make the already small 10x10 stall even smaller, so that she couldn't do it as easily. And she also developed a lot of physical issues from the damage that repeated weaving would do on the foot that she was mostly pivoting off of. And so yeah, there can be really intense stressors and traumas that horses have that I honestly think like we should just help them cope with and offer them a life where that stressor doesn't have to be triggered all the time, rather than being like, I need to fix this completely. And it's like the same thing with horses who crib, for example. The stress of having the cribbing suppressed by a collar oftentimes increases their baseline level of stress substantially enough that it's much more valuable to address the management problems that make them more likely to crib, try to reinforce alternative behaviors to make them more likely to do them and make those behaviors more reinforcing, and then to offer them the very type of lifestyle that means they don't really have to crib very much, rather than suppressing the behavior itself or trying to put them in a situation where they are like forced to not be able to engage in the behavior. But yeah, trauma is real, and I think we need to alter how we deal with trauma in horses. It's the same thing with like horses who pull back. They feel trapped. Forcing them to feel trapped and just pull back until they shut down is not a solution. It's not going to make tying a pleasant experience, and it might make it convenient for people if they shut down to the point where they just let it happen. But it's not a healthy response to it. And for horses who pull back really badly, like maybe any tension on the rope will incite that fear response. Is it really that big of a deal to teach them how to ground tie? Or to reinforce tying to the point where you can just loop the rope really gently through the tie ring, and if they pull back it just loosens, but they don't go anywhere because you've reinforced the behaviors in such a way that they don't feel the need to exit. Is it really that big of a deal? No. um, so yeah, there's all of these traumas that horses experience on a pretty regular basis that we take for granted how impactful it is to the horse and how hard it is on the horse to cope with. And like with my Mustangs, I've kind of been exposed to that as well, especially with my Mustang Mesa, because she's much more traumatized than what Juniper is. And yeah, they're both Mustangs, but Juniper's roundup was probably less traumatic. And she was also a little bit younger when she got rounded up. So she hadn't had as much time outside being wild as Mesa did. And Mesa was also in holding for way longer. And she also has like an eye injury where something happened. I don't know what, but her trauma is real nonetheless. I don't need to know exactly what it was to know that she needs more time than other horses do. And she needs more patience and understanding than what a lot of other horses do in order to get past whatever she's going through, and that she might not completely get past it anyways. I would never, ever put that horse in a situation where she was ever like out in a stall by herself or put in a small area, because she needs the space and she's been through enough in her life that there's no reason for her to do that. I would never ever prioritize selling her to a show home where the priority is showing, because that's not what's best for her. And just because she might be able to get to the point where she's okay with it doesn't mean that it's what's best for her. So that's kind of like where I've altered my mindset, where it's like I'm going to be more like focused on altering what I can do to make horses more comfortable and to make it as comfortable as possible for them to start to address aspects of their trauma. But no longer am I going to have this expectation that just because I want to do something, that it's their job to do it, and that they should be able to completely get past their trauma to the point where they're useful and beneficial to me in whatever way I choose to use them, because it's not a really fair perspective to have. And we expect so much from horses. Like, it's honestly insane. We're so lucky that they're not more aggressive or cruel or unkind than they are to us, because like we would deserve it. Like, if they were more of an aggressive species, we would have way more deaths than what we have of people getting injured by horses. And we're really lucky that horses are such a kind species and that they try to de-escalate wherever possible, because like a lot of other species, if we handle them the way that we handled horses, they would be like out to get us. And some horses are, and they get to the point where they've had enough and they do become very aggressive, but it's such an unnatural and unusual behavior for horses. And it's we're really, really fortunate that they are benevolent and kind as they are. Because if they weren't, we would get really, really hurt, more so than what we already are. So that's something that I'm forever grateful for, is just the amount of forgiveness and willingness to move past negative treatment that horses have shown me, despite how cruelly a lot of them have been treated, and just their willingness to trust again. Because like the fact that they're even willing to afford us that at all is something that's really special, and I do think a lot of people take that for granted, and it's not really fair to the horse. Like, we need to honor their type of fear a little bit more, and kind of take ourselves out of the equation, where we're not so putting ourselves first and thinking we're the main character and putting our goals first, because we have to just try to honor their experience. I think the last thing I want to share with everyone before I dip out of this live is that a little while ago I had like this really realistic dream, where I was looking at the world through my dog's eyes, through the context of like me taking her to the vet. And I was looking at it through her eyes when I passed her off to the vet, and they took her away and dragged her, because she was trying to get back to me, through the door of the vet. and she was panicking, and I could feel the panic, and I could feel the fear of like basically getting kidnapped by someone and taken somewhere, not knowing you're going to go back, not knowing you're ever going to see your owner again with no context, and just the absolute fucking terror that would cause you. And like I would liken the feeling that I felt in that dream to if you were just walking down the street and someone pulled over in a van and grabbed you and kidnapped you and you had no idea if you were going to ever get home. And ever since having that dream, I've been like, holy crap. Like, we expect so much from animals because that level of terror without the context of knowing everything's going to be okay is horrific. And it has really changed how I view things now because I'm like, that, like, the amount of discomfort and just sheer absolute fear that we put animals through, and then we just expect them to deal with it because we know it's necessary if it's for like a vet procedure or something. They don't know that, and it can't, something being necessary doesn't mean that their fear is not valid and that they should just have to cope with it. So we should be doing our best to make things as easy and nice and understanding as possible for them as we can, because the level of terror that we've just like accepted in inflicting on animals just because we want or need to do certain things for them is honestly pretty crazy. And if we put ourselves in their shoes, like actually put ourselves in their shoes without looking at it from a human sense where you know the context of why something is happening, I think we would have a greater appreciation for all of these things that these animals actually let us do to them. Because it's honestly wild. And that dream was really eye-opening for me, and it has made it really hard for me to take my dog to the vet, which is why like she always gets sedated when we go because it's stressful for her. And like I've taken the initiative to find her a female vet because she's more comfortable with the female vet, and it goes a lot better, to the point now where with the female vet in specific, she doesn't need sedatives in the same way. But then when she had to get her leg surgery, it's like the only surgeon that we had access to was a man, and then she had to get whisked off and go get handled by a man for that, and it was really traumatic and scary for her, so I felt really bad for her. But I think just having the more compassion that we can have to really understand how certain things impact them and how they might feel about some of the things that we do, maybe out of necessity or just out of sheer desire to do them, just to consider how it might actually feel to them when they don't have the context that we have or the goals that we have, and just change how we go about things accordingly. Because like I know for a fact that like no human would be happy coping with a lot of the stuff that we ask our animals, especially horses, to go through on a regular basis if they didn't have the context and like the thinking power that they do, and also the autonomy that they do. The loss of autonomy and not being able to control what happens to you is really, really scary. And it's something that we kind of feel entitled to with all animals, but like particularly horses, there's this certain expectation that they owe certain behaviors to us, and that when they respond like flight animals, that it's a bad thing. And it's just honestly so messed up. So whenever your animal is struggling, just consider the fact that they are struggling. They're not out to get you. They're not out to upset you. They're not out to be bad. Your horse isn't out to just defy you just for the sake of defying you. They actually truly are afraid, whether or not you understand why or not. The best you can do is just try to understand their experience and go, yeah, you're afraid. I don't understand why necessarily, but I can see that your fear is real to you, and that must be really difficult. And for anyone who's ever had panic attacks or anything, try to look at it through that lens. When you can get triggered for a panic attack without even knowing what the actual trigger is. So for horses, they could have trauma triggers that we are completely unaware of, and that we don't know exactly what's triggered a trauma response, but to them it could be like a sight, a smell, a sound, or anything. We're not necessarily always going to know, but that doesn't make it any less real for them. So we should do our best to put the effort in to just be understanding as possible, without needing to know the whole why. So anyways, thank you everyone for listening. I go into more detail kind of like on what the topic of this thing is, where I was talking about like how horses changed my life and whatnot, and how they've kind of influenced a major shift in how I've perceived everything in the world. I just recorded a podcast on that today that you can check out. and you can do so at the link down below in the description of this YouTube video. On Facebook Live, it's not going to be in the description, but it's linked in my pinned post. Or you can just look up my podcast, Making Milestones, and I have a lot of different episodes where I talk about these things at length. And for people who don't like watching the video along with this, like the live videos, the podcasts are kind of like the same type of thing, but you can just walk around and do your thing while listening to them. So anyways, thank you everyone for supporting my work, and just, yeah, for being here, because we all have so much to learn from each other and from our horses if we just listen. We would all be so much further along with handling horses if we just started to let go of the human belief that we're always right, and to start to honor animals' experiences more, and to just try to learn what we can from them. So anyways, thank you everyone for listening, and have a great day. And you can check out my other socials and whatnot at the links in the descriptions or on my other pages. And I always appreciate hearing like what you think, any suggestions for topic ideas in the future, because it's really helpful. It helps give me inspiration. And yeah, so if you ever have any suggestions, or if you want to share with me like how a live or podcast made you feel, I always love hearing, and I do read all of the comments, no matter if I like or respond to them or not. I do see them and I do appreciate them. So thank you everyone, and have a great day.